The Trump administration has not been shy about taking ownership interests and otherwise participating directly in businesses that we otherwise thought were in the private sector. Our colleague Michael McKee brings us up to speed on what's been done so far.
My administration will offer GM and Chrysler a limited additional period of time.
It isn't a new practice. The government took stakes in auto and insurance companies during the great financial crisis. But it is a shift. At that time, the idea was to provide funding backstop to keep the companies alive. Both General Motors and Chrysler were effectively insolvent, facing collapsing sales, frozen credit markets, and imminent bankruptcy. The U.S. ended up owning about 61% of GM and 10% of Chrysler. When they returned to health, the government sold its shares, in both cases at a loss. Today, the Trump administration is taking significant equity stakes in a number of American companies, 10% in chipmaker Intel, a 15% stake in rare earths firm MP Materials that came with a government guarantee on product prices and sales, shares in companies such as Lithium Americas and Trilogy Metals, a so-called golden share in Nippon Steel. This time, the goal isn't to prevent bankruptcies, but to make a profit and theoretically strengthen supply chains for American manufacturers. Administration officials insist national security is at stake. China, Russia, and other malevolent competitors cannot be allowed to get a strategic advantage in energy, defense production, and AI. The government backing can certainly help. MP Materials shares rose 224% last year. Critics say the government should not be picking winners and losers or influencing outcomes in the private sector. The government's goals may not align with the companies and lead to misallocation of capital. Ownership may reduce competition and innovation. State capitalism is a slippery slope away from free markets.
It's not as if the U.S. government has never taken ownership interests in private companies before, but this time is different.
I think a number of things are different. First of all is simply the number of situations. He's done everything from a golden share in U.S. Steel to stock in Intel to what you might call an export tax on chips to China. It's just all over the place. There doesn't seem to be any particular rhyme or reason to it.
Steve Rattner is chairman and CEO of Willett Advisors, which invests the personal and philanthropic assets of Bloomberg founder and majority shareholder Michael Bloomberg. Rattner served as the point person for President Obama for restructuring the U.S. auto industry during the great financial crisis.
When I was in the government and we thought about taking stock in Chrysler and General Motors, we went through a whole process of what we called the USG, the U.S. government as shareholder, and how would this work and what would we do and what were the guardrails, and a lot of thought went into it. This just seems to be the opposite. And so it's a hodgepodge of things, and it feels as much the president is just doing this because he can. He kind of keeps forgetting he's not in the private sector anymore, and he sees money on the table and he just goes and tries to get it. We took the interest in the auto companies not because we wanted to, but because we had to. I'll never forget when we went to the White House and basically said, the only way we can save General Motors is to, in effect, nationalize it, take 60% of the equity. There was a lot of pushback, as you would imagine, and eventually everyone realized it was the only choice. So it was a last resort, not a first resort.
Adding to the ad hoc nature of the administration's intervention is its targeting individual companies rather than entire sectors. Sarah Bauerle Danzman is Associate Professor of International Studies at Indiana and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center.
We're a market-based economy, and the idea is that we want markets to pick winners, not governments. And what we're seeing in the current administration is much more willingness to pick particular winners.
And the Trump administration has used the device of taking interest in order to overcome political resistance to deals that it believes will be good for the economy overall, like when it took a so-called golden share in U.S. Steel.
I do think the case of U.S. Steel is a little bit different. It was a very controversial merger. I personally thought it was perfectly fine. Steel is not a national security commodity these days. You can buy steel anywhere in the world. People would love to sell it to you, but it was politically a very tough one. And that one I would actually give the White House some credit, that it was a clever way to get past the political opposition. It does not involve any ownership. I doubt they will ever exercise it. So yeah, I'd put that in a different bucket than saying that NVIDIA has to pay, in effect, a tax on sending chips to China.
Whatever the justification, when the government becomes an owner, even a partial owner, in private business, it necessarily changes market dynamics, injecting factors beyond simply supply and demand and economic performance.
The concern is that the more that the U.S. kind of pushes in this direction of picking specific winners and therefore losers in industries, is that it distorts markets, right? We, as a market-based economy, we have a long track record of seeing that when market actors are the ones that are generating and evaluating information and then making capital allocation decisions on the basis of commercial preferences and commercial interests, that we tend to see over the long run that leads to more innovation, more wealth, more economic development as a whole. And the concern is that the more that the government gets involved in individual business decisions, the more we are kind of breaking that kind of market-based understanding of how information is generated in an economy and how companies and how investors make decisions. And that is an important distinction, because when the government is taking direct stakes in companies, the concern is that now that company is going to be pressured to not always make the best business decisions on the basis of kind of commercial concerns, but now also political concerns.
The free market purist would say that the government should never get involved as an owner in American business. But does the performance of China in advancing rapidly in important sectors argue for some move away from purely private ownership?
If you talk to anybody in China, they would tell you that the state-owned enterprises are almost universally less well run than the purely private companies. On the other hand, when Xi Jinping says our strategic priority is to develop a chips business, everybody marches toward developing a chips business, and lo and behold, they make enormous progress. And so it's a very tough balancing act. I think on balance, my view would be better to do less than more, or none rather than some, because I think the chances of getting it right for a government are relatively low.
Does the experience with China so far actually almost require the United States to revisit the balance between the government and the private sector?
I think that China is a very different country with a different political culture. It's organized in different ways. When you have so many workers who are integrating into a formal economy and through formal work and factory work with very long hours, it's very hard to see how that translates into the type of economy that would work in the U.S. and that citizens in the U.S. would actually feel good about. So I think that we want to be careful to not become China in our kind of quest to ensure that we're able to compete in the global economy in which China is doing very well right now. That said, there are specific areas of the economy that the Chinese model, and in particular concerns over Chinese oversupply, need more than just an uncoordinated market response to that.
Whether it's semiconductors or steel or rare earth minerals, the Trump administration has justified its actions most often on the ground of national security needs.
What role, if any, does national security play in this? Does that make it a more persuasive, if not compelling, case for a government to have an ownership interest?
Well, of course, it first of all makes the politics of taking stakes like this more tenable, because national security concerns have bipartisan support. Congress should be part of the discussion around, how much are we going to allocate in terms of funding to support these kinds of interventions into specific companies? How are we going to decide what are the strategic priorities? How are we going to ensure that the process through which companies are determined to be eligible for these kinds of programs is done in a way that is not about corruption and graft?
We've looked around the world over the years and said a lot of countries are corrupt because of what the relationships are between private interests and government interests in various industries. What are the risks here, even of the appearance of corruption, as these investments are made in companies that often have some connection to the Trump family?
I think we're past the point of appearance of corruption. I think we're fully in corruption. I think this administration, and I don't mean to sound like a partisan, but I've never seen anything like it in my entire life. People have said, for example, that Lyndon Johnson sort of tilted the board in favor of getting a bunch of television licenses in Texas that made him wealthy. Okay, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But that was then, this is now, that was one thing, this is like everything. Whether you want to talk about meme coins, whether you want to talk about rare earth minerals, whether you want to talk about real estate developments in the Middle East, whether you want to talk about Jared Kushner raising $5 billion, of which virtually all of it, 99% of it, came from the Middle East. This administration knows no bounds.
Setting aside the potential morality of it, what does it do to the economy? I mean, we've thought for a long time that actually a free market economy served us well in terms of growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of standards of living. What are the threats, potentially, to the very foundations of our economy?
Well, let's put it in a few different buckets. First of all, I think the corruption that we just talked about, as distasteful as it is, and I find it reprehensible, it's small potatoes in the great scheme of an economy that's $20+ trillion. I mean, right, let's be serious. I think the government taking some of these equity interests or putting these like taxes, if you want to call them that, on things, also relatively small potatoes in the great scheme of things. I think the most worrisome thing, which may not fall exactly into the corruption bucket, is the fact that companies feel like this is an administration that will reward its friends and punish its enemies. The CEO of Exxon said the other day, for example, that Venezuela was uninvestable. Seems like an obvious statement to me. The president immediately said, well, I'm not going to pick Exxon to be my partner of choice in Venezuela if we actually get hold of any of this oil. And so companies, and I hear this from CEOs all the time, are terrified about what they say, what they do, and trying to figure out how to avoid antagonizing a president who has made retribution a fulcrum part of this administration. So I think that's the real danger here.